fun polls and stuff too. But you can feel free to hit record on this for everyone else. So anyways, where are we at right now? So we are in this place that's called Modi'in, which is a city that is right in between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And this is the place where Matityahu and his 5 sons are all born and raised, who are this is a family of priests that live in the area of Modi'in, where as Kohanim, as priests, throughout the year, once or twice, or maybe even 3 times a year, they would head over to Jerusalem to fulfill their priestly duties and do all this work in Jerusalem. But I've taken you here to understand a little bit about what has been found in this place, Modi'in, that maybe sheds light on who Matityahu and his brothers and his sons were. And this place that's over here is actually the most ancient synagogue ever found in the land of Israel. So there are a couple of ancient synagogues that were found that are a little bit older than this one. This one dates back at least to the 2nd century BCE, and maybe even goes before that. Now, synagogues during the time of the Maccabees was different than what synagogues are nowadays, where the synagogues nowadays are mostly focused on tefillot. This is a place where you daven. This is a place where you pray. But back then, synagogues were mostly used as places for people to gather together and to study some Torah, to study together. Kind of like where Zoom is for nowadays, I guess, during pandemic years. But that is all besides the point. We have left Modi'in and we've gone to the place where all of the action starts. And here we are in Jerusalem. Now, what's fun about doing these tours, again, is that we get to see the really amazing sights from way up above. When do you ever get to have a bird's eye view of Jerusalem that pans all the way across the city? Now, Jerusalem, as you can see from this image that's over here, is much, much, much larger than Jerusalem of the time of the Maccabees, where Jerusalem of the time of the Maccabees is just this little tiny strip of land. It's this little tiny hill that's over here with a relatively small Temple Mount area. Now, if you look at today's Jerusalem, you can see the Temple Mount, which is over here, which I believe many, many months ago, I did a tour of the Temple Mount with Beth David. Now, but I don't expect you to remember all the things from the Temple Mount tour, but this is the Temple Mount of today. And the original city of Jerusalem was just this little tiny hill that was over here. And again, we're talking about a city that had a few thousand people and nowhere near the amount of people that it is today, which is something like 800,000 or 900,000 people. Now, what happens in Jerusalem that sets off this whole motion of Chanukah and the whole story of Chanukah and the Maccabees is that there was a new priest that came into town, that there was someone named Menelaus who decided that he wanted to be the high priest of the temple. But the problem was that he was not HaKohen. It's like the old Jewish joke where it's the guy who wants to pay the rabbi $1 million to become a Kohen, but he says, whatever, eventually he ends up taking the money, and then he says, oh, because I wanted to be a Kohen because my father was a Kohen and my grandfather was a Kohen. Well, this Menelaus guy was not born into a priestly family, but he did have enough money to pay Antiochus IV, the emperor of the Seleucid Greek Empire to the north, where he pays Antiochus IV lots and lots and lots of money in order to become the high priest in Jerusalem. And Antiochus has no problem and installs him as the high priest in the temple. Now, this already got Matityahu and all of his sons incredibly upset. That you had this person who was not born a priest becoming the high priest, the highest priest in Israel, the most powerful person in all of the Jewish world. But if that wasn't enough, the other thing that Antiochus IV did was that he built this massive fortress that's called the Chakra, builds it just down below where the Temple Mount is today, just down below where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is, just over here. He builds this massive structure called the Chakra, which overlooked the temple, was even higher up than the temple, even though it is much lower down physically. It is much lower down, but the building itself was able to tower over it. And this really got Matityahu upset. And when Matityahu heard that that Antiochus IV went over to Egypt and he died in Egypt, he got really excited, Matityahu, and says, okay, great, we're going to start a revolt and win Jerusalem back for the regular Jews, to bring Jerusalem back to its glory years. But as it turns out, Antiochus, much like the Monty Python skit, was, I'm not dead yet. And he comes back to Jerusalem and he is shocked that people were revolting against him. And he enacts all of these laws against the Jewish people. No more circumcision, no more keeping kosher, no more keeping Shabbat. And these rules really set everything in motion. And now all of a sudden, you have to have not just a little, civil protest or a little bit of revolt, but now it's going to be an all-out war over Jewish existence. And the general who leads the Jewish people in battle against the Greeks is this man over here, Judah Maccabee, the son of Matityahu, one of the 5 sons of Matityahu. And he leads a ragtag group of a few hundred soldiers with a bunch of improvised weapons against the greatest army in the whole world, the descendants of Alexander the Great, and their hundreds, maybe thousands of elephants, and their battle formations known as the phalanx formation, which basically makes like a human tank with all these spears that are waiting for little tiny armies like Judah Maccabee to even try to challenge them. But what's different this time is that Judah Maccabee challenges them up in the hills, in the steep and rocky hills north of Jerusalem, which I'm going to show you where it is in just a second. But it's in these hills over here that Judah Maccabee finds he is most comfortable fighting the Greeks, because those elephants aren't so good up on these hills. And that phalanx formation isn't so good. You can't really stay together when you're up on steep hills like this. And Judah Maccabee knows the hills well. He knows the bushes and the rocks. He knows all of this area all too well, and he knows exactly how to fight against them. Now, Rabbi Walker before asked if any of you guys are spinning any dreidels lately. So what we're going to be doing now, because we're going to be talking about all these different battles that the Maccabees fought against the Greeks. And in order to figure out who won those battles, we need to spin some dreidels. So if any of you guys have any dreidels with you nearby, feel free to go and grab them, and we can spin our dreidels together and understand who won these wars. So Rabbi Walker sung for you this exact same song just a few minutes ago, except for it wasn't really the exact same song. There's a little bit of a difference. If any of you guys noticed the difference between the version that I just played for you and the version that Rabbi Walker had sung for you earlier. So what are some of the differences? You can feel free to just unmute or type it in the chat. I don't know if you guys wanted to just feel free to just jump right in. What was the main difference between the way that, I see Ruth Shapiro gets the answer right with writing the word po. Exactly. Where here in Israel we sing Nes Gadol Haya Po, that a great miracle happened here, and where Rabbi Walker was singing a great miracle happened there. That was very true about a few minutes ago, before you guys were virtually in the land of Israel. But now I've taken you virtually in the land of Israel. So the great miracle happened here. And after every battle, we are going to spin our dreidels to help us understand if it was a great victory for the Maccabees, a big gimel, or was it a hey, it was a good victory, but it wasn't like the biggest victory we could have had. Was it a nun, just like a meh? Neither side really won. Or was it a shin or a pei where the Greeks won? So the first battle, as I've already set it up, we've got the little guys versus the big guys in the hill country. Who's going to win the first battle? We've got a gimel for Judah Maccabee coming through and gimmeling the Greeks. They had no idea what was coming when they were fighting against Judah Maccabee up in the hill country just north of Jerusalem. But they said, okay, fine. They win one battle. What's the big deal? We're just going to have to fight in another battle. And we'll take them out in battle number 2, right? Now, if you notice where this map, where it has all the battles of the Judeans versus the Greeks, you can see number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There were 8 battles that took place between the Judeans and the Greeks. This is interesting. 8 battles. 8, that's a number that's really familiar for Hanukkah, right? Remember that there were 8 battles. It's very important. So we have battle number 1 that takes place just north of Jerusalem. even north of Ramallah, even of today, where it's around 30 some odd kilometers north. But battle number two, the Greeks are trying to get to Jerusalem from the northwest. If you notice that all of these battles take place along the roads that lead into Jerusalem, and that's because the whole MO of the Greeks is to try to access Jerusalem once again. That they are all trying to access that Chakra, that huge, massive fortress that's in Jerusalem that's been completely isolated by Judah Maccabee and all of his forces. So the Greeks try to attack from all the different directions in order to make it into Jerusalem once again. And so they fail from the north. So they decide to go from the northwest. Little do they know that Judah Maccabee's hometown is literally right here. So of all places to fight against Judah Maccabee, why would you fight in his backyard right next to Modi'in? He knows exactly all the hills that are over here. So what are we talking about here when we have the Battle of Beit Horon, battle number 2, and it's going to be another big gimel for Judah Maccabee again. All right, we got a big gimel again. That's 2 gimels in a row. Could you imagine that the Greeks keep on losing these battles? Oh, this is pretty nuts. Now, we're going to get on to this third battle between the Maccabees and the Greeks. Now, this battle that takes place is the most famous and the most important of all of the 8 battles between Judah Maccabee, the Jews, and the Seleucid Greeks at Antiochus' army. Now, in this time, the Greeks decide to change it up. They say, okay, fine. We keep on losing to Judah Maccabee up in the hills, so let's bring the battle to the valley. And they set up camp down over here in the Ayalon Valley, in the Emek Ayalon, which is famous for not just its battle that took place here in the Maccabean period, which is known as the Battle of Emmaus in the Ayalon Valley. It's also famous for having the Highway 1, which leads to the Ayalon. For any of you who have driven in Israel, you may have been stuck in traffic on this very road. How exciting! Or for any of you who have been to Israel recently, maybe you've taken a train between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and this is the bridge that leads in between those 2 cities that's over there. Now, while the Greeks have set up camp in the valley, Judah Maccabee set up his camp up here on the hill country of the Ayalon Valley. Now, Judah Maccabee's way up here in the hills and is expecting that tomorrow, the next day, he's going to have to go down to the valley to meet up with the Greeks in battle. And he's going to have to prove to the Greeks that, yeah, you think I can only fight in the hills? I can fight in the valley below too. And the Greeks are saying, okay, great, playing right into our hands. But the Greeks actually have another strategy in mind. They said, okay, fine. You know what? You're going to be up in the hills and you're going to come down to us. But what you're not going to expect is that if in the middle of the night, we decide to bring half of our forces from our camp in a night maneuver, cross the highway, go up the bridge that goes up to the train, that goes into Jerusalem on the train. And we're going to go and attack your camp in the middle of the night, torch it when you least expect it. And the Greeks creep across the valley and they get up to the hill and they see that there's all these bonfires, there's all this noise going on. They know that they've got Judah Maccabee and all of his soldiers just waiting right there. They're about to just destroy the Jewish camp. And they arrive there, and what do they see? There's 3 or 4 people running around, lighting bonfires and making lots of noise as if there's lots of people, and no one else is there. And then they turn around, and they notice that Judah Maccabee had lit their own camp completely on fire and taken all of their amazing weapons and all of their things that they were going to use to defeat the Maccabees with the next day. And once they saw their camp up in flames, they realized, oh my goodness, Judah Maccabee must have had a spy in our camp. What a mess. What a disaster. And they run away to the north, scared of Judah Maccabee and his forces. And the result of this battle, as you can imagine, isn't just really one gimel. This is like a triple gimel of a victory between the Judeans and the Greeks. Now, we're not going to go into the details of every single battle like I've done already up until now. Battle number 4, all you have to know from this battle is that the Greeks were about to win this battle, but at the end of the battle, they found out that Antiochus IV died. But for this time, he actually died. He didn't just pretend to die, or there were rumors about his death. And so because he had died, afterwards, there was a lot of political turmoil on the Seleucid Greek side. And they said, enough of all this fighting over here. Enough of all this fighting. We're not going to deal with these Judean revolts anymore. Instead, we're just going to let them have Jerusalem and let them have their own little area around Jerusalem that they can call their own. And it is at this point that the Maccabees and the Jewish forces arrive to the temple in Jerusalem, and they see that it had become this Greek temple that had been completely defiled by Menelaus and all of his friends, and it was no longer the holy Jewish temple that it once was. And it is at this point that we have the most famous story of Hanukkah, where you have that little jug of oil that lasts from one night, that's supposed to last one night, that lasts 8 nights total.
כל העם אז התכנס והכריז אך זהו נס אילולא כד זה נשאר מקדשנו לא הואר אילולא כד זה נשאר
Right, so you have this idea that this little tiny jug managed to last 8 nights when it didn't even last, when it wasn't supposed to last more than one. And this source of the miracle of Hanukkah comes from a much later source than the Maccabees. This source actually just comes from the Talmud itself, from the Talmud Bavli, which is written around 500 or even 600 years after all the stories of all the Maccabees had long been written and long been recorded by both the Maccabees and Josephus, the Roman Jewish historian, a little bit later on, by Philo, who wrote a little bit about the Maccabees. There's any number of different sources about all these wars, about all these personalities that were important during the period of the Maccabees. But what's interesting is that none of those sources, until the Talmud, tells us this story of the oil lasting for 8 nights. Now, why is this story told in the Talmud but not anywhere else? So there's a number of different theories about why that might be the case. And one of the theories is that the rabbis were not living in a time where there was Jewish independence. They were living in a time where they were controlled by the Romans. They were under the rule of the Romans, or under the rule of the Persians, or whoever was around in the Middle East, that they were underneath their rule, and they basically didn't want to be asked by these ruling parties, hey, so what's this holiday you guys are celebrating? Oh, well, we're celebrating this holiday when we overthrew the Greek government because they were not treating us so nicely, and we led this whole revolt that lasted for many, many years, and we fought very hard against them, and we defeated them, and yay, we're now independent. So they didn't want to tell these empires like the Roman Empire, which really identified themselves as kind of like the continuation of the Greeks, that we'd be celebrating a holiday that overthrew them. No. Instead, they said, no, we're celebrating when this oil lasted for 8 days, this miracle from God that allowed us to rededicate the temple. Don't worry, we're not even trying to rebuild the temple. We're just trying to remember this time of the oil lasting for 8 days. And what's cool is that on the Temple Mount itself, there have been all these really amazing findings, like these oil jugs that date back to the Hashmonaim period, to the Hasmonean period. There's even a coin of Antiochus IV that was found up here on the Temple Mount that shows that this place really was, in a way, influenced by Antiochus, by the Greeks that were over here. And of course, even more impressive than all of that is in 1927, when there was the earthquake on the Temple Mount, and then there was a little bit of an archaeological excavation underneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque, they found a Hashmonaim, a Maccabean mikvah that was down over here. So it shows that there really was this great presence of the Maccabees up here on the Temple Mount. But more importantly is trying to get to that question of, if the miracle of the oil wasn't really until a later tradition that it really started to take hold. So why do we light a Chanukiah instead of a menorah on Chanukah? Now keep in mind that a Chanukiah that we light is 8 candles plus that one in the middle. So it's really 9 candles that we're lighting. Well, a menorah, as you can see over here, which is in the middle of the Jewish quarter in Jerusalem, right? We're right next to the Chorva synagogue that's over here and in the middle of the Jewish quarter. So it's a really fun adventure that we're doing in Jerusalem. Now look at the different images that I want to show you now over here. The menorah really looks like this. Why do I say it looks like this? Unlike the gold one that is behind that case, this is the most accurate image I could show you of the menorah, because this is made by someone who would have seen the menorah with their own eyes. This is an image that was found in Pki'in, which is in the north of Israel, in the Galilee, where this image is probably from 2,200 years ago or 2,100 years ago by someone who would have seen the menorah with their own eyes. Now, remember, a menorah has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 branches, while the Chanukiah has 9 branches. If we're celebrating this oil lasting for 8 nights, why don't we light a menorah, a full menorah, for 8 nights in a row? Really showing off that this is what the Maccabees, is the miracle of Hanukkah, that the oil lasted for 8 nights, lit on a menorah of 7 branches. I know it doesn't sound as nice to light, we light, 1 candle each night, but the way that the miracle really happened was lighting a menorah for 8 nights in a row. Now, in order to answer this question, I want to take you to Tel Aviv. I want to leave Jerusalem and take you to Tel Aviv. Because in Tel Aviv, there's a new philosophy that was born about Chanukah. And that might answer our question of why we light a Chanukiah and not a menorah on Chanukah. Now, with the advent of early Zionism, around 100 years ago or so, sorry, for some reason my images aren't loading up. Let me just get it to load up. And with the advent of modern Zionism, they really took to heart this idea of Chanukah being not just about this oil lasting for 8 nights, but about the battles that were fought against the Greeks. And they noticed something really funny about the Chanukiah that is different than the menorah, which is that the Chanukiah really shows a map of all of the battles between the Judean fighters, the Jews under Judah Maccabee versus the Greeks, where there's 1, 2, 3, 4 battles, and then the temple is rededicated. And then you have 1, 2, 3, 4 more battles. And then you have the nation of Israel, the nation of Judea, becoming an independent state, that they managed to get their own independence from the Greeks. Now, that is how the Chanukiah is built. It's built to commemorate these 8 battles. And the most important of all of the candles is that shamash that's in the middle, this one that's lit every single night without question, that this candle that's in the middle is the one that is able to, that is the focus of the first 4 battles. And it's the one that keeps us going for the next 4 battles, even if it's really tough to keep on fighting. But at the end of the day, the goal wasn't just to rededicate the temple. The goal was really to get that whole independent nation. Now, this is reflected also in another amazing Chanukah song that is very popular, or that was very popular in Israel with the advent of Zionism. Funny song that they're glorifying the fact that a miracle did not happen to us. And this was so important to the secular Zionist movement, which says, we're not waiting for God to create some sort of miracle. Our miracle is that we are going to come together as a people and we're going to fight together and we are going to earn our independence that way. And the whole reason for getting independence and the great, fun thing about celebrating Hanukkah in Israel nowadays actually has nothing to do with the Chanukiah. It has nothing to do with the oil lasting for 8 days. And it has everything to do with, and I'm sorry that my screen is lagging a little bit. I guess the storm in Tel Aviv is really taking its toll on my internet. I'm really, really sorry, everyone. 1 second. It should be popping up. There we go. The real reason why we celebrate Chanukah in Israel today has nothing to do with that Chanukiah, as I mentioned before, and it has everything to do with the Roladin bakery and all the delicious bakeries all over Israel, and how sufganiyot in the last 10 years or so have really gone crazy in Israel, more so than anything else that you could imagine. You can see that a sufganiyah, which we're used to, those kind of donuts have a little bit of the filling, just like a Tim Hortons donut with a little bit of a filling. You can see that the donuts here in Roladin have gone absolutely bonkers. There's candy on them, there's Oreos, there's cream, there's fruit, there's any number of different fun things that you could put on top of the sufganiyah. And what's better than having a little bit of jelly in your donut or a little bit of chocolate in your donut? How about more jelly or more chocolate? How do you get that? Well, you get these little tiny plastic tubes you put on the top of the donut and you go and you squirt in that little extra jelly. Or how about up here on the top where you have the chocolate on the extra, you could put a little bit of extra chocolate inside your jelly donut. Why not doing all of that? That's the real best way to celebrate, Chanukah, is to get as fat as possible, to have the sufganiyot last for 8 nights or even, 8 weeks. Why not? Now, the sufganiyot in Israel, the sufganiyah culture really starts the moment after Simchat Torah. All of a sudden the bakeries put out their sufganiyot, kind of like exactly the day after Halloween in North America. All of a sudden everyone is ready for Christmas. So it's the same thing in Israel, but for sufganiyot. And every year there's this one-upmanship with all the different bakeries in Israel of who can make the craziest sufganiyot, who can really top them up to, stack up these sufganiyot that make it almost impossible to eat them all. But they're so, so, so delicious. But really, they're so heavy that you can only eat one at a time. So if you're only going to eat one per day or whatever of those ones, so why not adopt some of the tradition from the North African Jewish community, which is to eat sfingim. And a sfinge is the deep-fried dough that you sprinkle all this little bit of sugar on the top of it. Now, these don't sit as heavy on you as the sufganiyot do, but it's very dangerous as well because you can eat like 8 or 9 of them in one sitting, and they are just magnificent. So I highly recommend, while Hanukkah is still on, to try to get yourselves a fancy sufganiyah, as fancy as you can get, or to make for yourself a sfinge. They're really fun to make. They're really easy to make, and really, really delicious. And it's a way to keep that oil lasting in your body for 8 days after the 8 days of Hanukkah as well. So you can keep on doing that. In the meantime, we're going to head back to our Maccabean battles against the Greeks, because the Greeks were not done yet. They waited a couple of years after a little bit of a hiatus from war, but they decided to keep on battling. And I'm now taking you to one of the greatest lookout points in the whole country, which is in Neve Daniel, in the Gush Etzion area, south of Jerusalem, where battle number 5 takes place. From this lookout, which is called the Mitzpor HaElef, the lookout 1,000, because we're 1,000 meters above sea level. It's one of the few places, if not the only place in all of Israel, where you can see the mountains in Jordan when you turn around this way. And if you turn back the other way, you can see the Mediterranean Sea. So it's really cool, this kind of view. But the battle that takes place here, in the Battle of Beit Zachariah, as it's known, is the battle where Elazar, one of the brothers of Judah Maccabee, meets his end, where he is battling with this one elephant. He tries to take down an elephant because he knows that on top of this elephant is the Greek general Nicanor, and he attacks this elephant. And these images that I'm showing you right now are all images from the Crusader period, who glorified the Maccabees because they saw the Maccabees as these freedom fighters who were fighting to free the infidel from the Holy Land. So they really identified with the Maccabees, and especially with the story of Elazar trying to slay the elephant, because he's someone who gave up his life for the cause. But even better than looking at old two-dimensional crusader images of the Maccabees, why not look at a more modern idea of how Eleazar destroyed the elephant by looking at George Lucas and his take in The Empire Strikes Back on how to destroy the greatest elephant warfare, the greatest elephant battle techniques. Now, this is obviously a really great scene, and it's a little bit fantastical, of course. Luke Skywalker, the hero of the Star Wars story, manages to make it out of there completely unscathed. Unfortunately, that was not the case for Eleazar, who meets his end when he fights with the elephant here in Beit Zachariah. But we can still imagine him being just like Luke Skywalker, going in and destroying the elephant just like Luke did. But it is at this point that after Eleazar is killed in battle that we reach the sixth battle against the Greeks. And it's at this point that the Judeans are at this point, demoralized. They can't believe that the Greeks keep on fighting them, and that this modern army keeps on coming at them harder and harder with each war. And it's getting more and more difficult for the Judean fighters to keep their morale up. Now, what's the best way to keep up morale? Well, the best way to keep up morale is to have an amazing, fictional female hero to keep you going. And it's at this point that this famous book at the time, that also is famous nowadays, called the Book of Judith, becomes this book that really inspires the Maccabean fighters. Now, it's a fictional tale. It's a fictional book that was written around this time, that became the most popular book of its day during the Maccabean period. Now, this Book of Judith is set in ancient Assyria. It's set 700 years before, 600 years before the Maccabees. And it's set where the Jews are fighting a revolt against the Assyrians. And they start losing, and they start, feeling like the Assyrians are too big to fight against. And Judith, this widow goes and she takes the matters into her own hands, and she finds the Assyrian king Holofernes, an awfully Greek name for a fictional Assyrian, and slays Holofernes by inviting him into her tent, feeding him lots of cheese and wine, getting him all drunk and fat. He falls asleep, and she cuts off his head and then serves his head on a platter, essentially showing it off to the whole Jewish community, saying, hey, you guys got to keep this fight up. We got to keep on fighting, because we can defeat these people just like I defeated this great general Holofernes. And this fictional book really inspired the Judeans to keep on going, really inspired all these Maccabee fighters to keep on fighting. Now, this tale became so popular that it appears in the Sistine Chapel. This is an image from Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, where Holofernes is lying in the bed, and you can see the head over here, and Judith carrying the head off. But even more fun than that is that in the Jewish world, this tale became so popular, especially in the Middle Ages, that it became a tradition in European Jewish customs to drink wine and eat cheese on Hanukkah. Now, we generally associate eating cheese with Shavuot, but even before it was a custom on Shavuot to eat cheese. You're supposed to do that on Hanukkah. So I highly recommend that for all of you guys who are still making latkes for the next few days, maybe put a little bit of cheese on the latke too, and you can think of Judith and the great tale of this fictional tale that inspired the Maccabees to keep on going. And eventually we're going to get to our battle number 8, where after a bunch of rough battles, we finally get to our ultimate battle, the ultimate showdown between the Judeans and the Greeks. And the battle takes place here, just north of Jerusalem. And you'd imagine that the eighth battle, the one that leads to the Jewish independence in the land of Judea, that this battle is going to be this great, huge victory for Judah Maccabee and all of his people. But as it turns out, this battle over here was the biggest loss of all of the 8 battles. And why is it the biggest loss? Judah Maccabee himself is killed in battle, in the Battle of El Asa in 160 BCE. Now, how is it that the end of our battles, all the 8 battles, that the last battle that leads to the Jewish independence in Judea is a loss to the Greeks? And the answer is pretty simple. At this point, again, the Jewish people, the Judeans, are saved by the Greeks' inner turmoil in the Seleucid Empire, that because there's all this turnover of different emperors, different generals who are fighting over political control in the city of Antioch, north of Israel. So they decide that enough is enough. We're not going to deal with these Judean rebels anymore. And they leave Judea in the hands of the Jews. And now you have this independent Jewish state in the land of Israel. And this is the first independent Jewish state in the land of Israel since the destruction of the temple in 586 BCE. Sorry once again about the black screens. Oh man. Usually in the middle of the night, the internet is even better than it is during the day. But I guess today, the stormy weather is really taking its toll. Anyways, after Judah Maccabee dies, his youngest brother, Jonathan, takes over. And after Jonathan, you have his other brother, the last remaining of all the brothers, named Shimon, and he takes over. Now, Shimon, or Simon, takes over, and while he is the ruler, he does a couple of things that are really important. While everything is loading, I'm really sorry. Oh, here we go. Sorry about that, everyone. Should be getting better in just a second. While Simon takes over as the ruler of the Judeans, I'm really sorry about this. I'm going to have to just refresh it in just a second. So while Simon is taking over as the ruler of the Judean forces, he decides a couple of things. One is that he wants to honor all of his brothers. And so he honors them by building these huge, massive pyramids, which I'm about to show you once everything starts to work again on my end with the images over here, which I'm sorry that it's not working so well. But he decides to build these huge, massive pyramids that could be seen all the way from Jaffa, from 30 some odd kilometers away from Modi'in, the hometown of the Maccabees. But even more important than him building these great things to honor his own brothers and honor his father in Modi'in, is that he starts a whole new political movement in a whole new political structure for how the Judean kings, if you will, even though he never called himself a king because he was a priest, and he knew that in the time of Tanakh, in the Bible, it was forbidden for a priest to become a king. So what does he do? He calls himself everything but a king. He says that I am, the leader I'm the general of the army, and I'm the high priest, but I'm not the king of the Judeans. Instead, I will be this kind of prince that rules over the people. But most importantly is that I'm going to rule not over the people, but I'm going to rule with the people. And he founds this group of people called the Sanhedrin, where he gathers together 120 advisors from all over Judea, from all over this little tiny country, this little tiny independent Jewish state. And he brings them all together in a place that he calls the Knesset HaGedolah, the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, or the Sanhedrin, which, for any of you who are keen listeners, that word Knesset might remind you of the parliament in Israel. The Knesset in Israel is named after this exact moment where Simon brings everyone together from all over the country as representatives so he can rule with the people and not just rule above the people as the Greek kings would have done. And to this day, just as there were 120 members of the Knesset under Shimon, there are 120 members of Knesset in Israel, 120 members in parliament in Israel, which always leads to the most incredible deadlocks, because 120 is a round number. It's an even number. So it makes it so that there can be votes that are 60 versus 60. And it's kind of built that way, but that's all besides the point. It's not really a big deal. Not that the Knesset is dysfunctional in any sort of way. If there's anything that we've learned in the last few years in the Israeli elections, is that everything is perfectly functional, just like under the time of Shimon. But that's all besides the point, and we're not here talking about modern Israeli politics. Instead, I wanted to show you that across from the Knesset is this image of the menorah, which automatically evokes this idea of the Maccabees themselves. And what's interesting is that just on the furthest right branch of the menorah, on the second image down, is this image here of these glorious Maccabees who are fighting for that Jewish independent state. But across the way on that menorah, on the other opposite branch, on the second branch down, there's an image of the destruction of the temple. And this man over here, Yochanan ben Zakkai, who is this great hero of the first century Judaism, where after the temple is destroyed, it is Yochanan ben Zakkai who puts in motion this new idea of rabbinic Judaism, that the Jewish people should be ruled by a meritocracy of people who study Torah, people who know the laws of God and can help communities, individual communities, stay strong as nice small Jewish communities and together as a whole nation, even if they are under the rule of other people. Now, it's interesting that these two images are put across from each other, as if they are parallel, they're commentary stories on each other, where the Maccabees fought for that Jewish independence. They fought to rededicate the temple, and this Jewish independent state lasted for 90 years, and it was the first Jewish independent country again since 586 BCE, and it is the last Jewish independent country until 1948, when we sing Hatikva and we say the hope is 2,000 years old. Hatikva bat shnot alpaim. We're talking about those 2,000 years since the Maccabees ruled and had that Jewish independent state in the land of Israel. That's what we've been longing for 2,000 years. But this Maccabean rule, this dynasty of the Hasmoneans, Shimon and Matityahu and Judah and all of their descendants that are going to come to follow, they only last for 90 years. While Yochanan ben Zakkai in rabbinic Judaism is the thing that kept Judaism going for 2,000 years, without a king, without a temple, without a Jewish state. This was the thing that kept the Jewish people alive and made them survive for all of those years. And so it's interesting to see where our Jewish values lie and kind of what is the most important aspect of Judaism. Is it really about this temple being restored, or is it about Judaism itself being flexible and Judaism being able to survive any number of different catastrophes that it has faced over the various different years? Now, I'm going to, in a way, finish with you with one kind of story that's a little bit about the Hasmonean dynasty that was to follow after Shimon. Because after Shimon, and again, he's one of the original 5 brothers of the Maccabees, after him, the Maccabees kind of fall a little bit into corruption and they war with each other, and they're not really so beloved by the Jewish people. And the most violent of all of these brothers, of all these Maccabean rulers, the Hasmonean rulers, was Alexander Yanai, who on one day was so despised on Sukkot that he was pelted with etrogim on Sukkot. Luckily, he wasn't pelted with eggs, like on, I don't know, because eggs are used in like Pesach and during Hanukkah, eggs are used again to make a lot of our baked goods and things like that. So luckily, it wasn't pelted with eggs, which would have smelled horrible. Instead, he was pelted with etrogim, which smell rather nice, and they're kind of soft too, so it must not have hurt that bad. But Alexander and I was so offended by the fact that he was pelted with all these etrogim when he was the king and the high priest of the Jewish people, that he then goes and sparks a civil war where tens of thousands of Jews are killed from either side, from the aristocracy, which was Alexander Yanai's side, versus the people, the Pharisees, the ones who Shimon himself, Alexander Yanai's grandfather, had welcomed into his government in order to make the Jewish people stronger. But Alexander Yanai tried very hard to, at the end of his life, after all these years of warring, he says, do you know what, at the end of the day, I wasn't right. I shouldn't have done all this civil war, and I'm going to try to make peace. But before he is able to make peace, he passes away. But his wife, Shlomtzion, is the one who's going to keep this peace, this dream of peace alive. Now, she becomes queen after her husband Alexander Yanai dies in the year 76, and she rules as queen for 9 years until the year 67 BCE. But as a woman, she is not allowed to be the high priest, so she gives that to her son, John Hyrcanus II, and she's not allowed to be the leader of the military, so she gives that to Aristobulus II. So what is it that she gets to do as queen? Well, you would think that, like watching The Crown, that she'd be like Queen Elizabeth and just kind of do nothing. But she doesn't actually do nothing. Instead, she forges peace treaties with, for any of you who are watching The Crown, I guess that's a fun joke for all of you guys. I guess we're all Canadians, so, Canadians love watching The Crown. So what does she do? Queen Shlomtzion Hamalka, she makes peace with the Romans. She makes peace with Tigranes II, who is the great ruler from Armenia, who was conquering the whole Middle East, except for he never conquered Judea because of how much he admired Shlomtzion. And Shlomtzion was so amazing, and the rabbis wrote about her that God blessed the land of Judea during the time that Shlomtzion ruled with so much rain, but only on Shabbat and at night, so that people could still enjoy the day during a regular day. They could still go out and enjoy their day, and that the wheat was massive, the barley was like olives, the lentils like gold coins, and they would gather for generations to come all of this amazing produce from the farms that would later sin, that they could gather all this stuff when the rains wouldn't be as good, because Shlomtzion's reign was a time that was really blessed by God. Now, to bring it back a little bit to Israeli politics, Ariel Sharon in the 1970s, the future Prime Minister Ariel Sharon in the 1970s, made a political party called Shlom Tzion, which was an attempt by Ariel Sharon to bring together the right wing and the left wing, which seemed to be so far apart from each other that could never come together. And as we all know from modern Israeli politics, there is nothing new under the sun, except for no one has named their party Shlom Tzion. Instead, they go by different names like Yesh Atid, Kachol Lavan, all these other kinds of parties like that. But maybe they'd have a bit more luck if they would name themselves after Shlom Tzion, just like Ariel Sharon. But the best thing that's named after Shlom Tzion Hamalka is the street Shlom Tzion Hamalka in Jerusalem, which has some delicious cafes and hummus places and ice cream places. The first sushi place in Jerusalem, Japanica, back in the day was on Shlom Tzion Hamalka. There's a really great soup place that's right off of the corner called Hamarakia. And the best place next time you're in Jerusalem, you have to check out Kadosh, which makes the best shakshuka in the whole country. So you got to definitely check that out next time you are in Jerusalem. Now, unfortunately, eventually the Maccabees, their rule ends up falling. The two sons of Shlom Tzion, John Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, end up warring with each other over control over Judea. And eventually the Romans jump in and they say, enough is enough with all these wars, with all you little civil warring each other in Judea. We're just going to come in and take over for all of you. And that was the end of the 90-year reign sorry about that, my screen is still black over here. That was the end of the 90-year reign of the Hasmonean dynasty. But it doesn't mean that it's the end of the Chanukah story. For the Chanukah story, it still has all these things that mean so much to us to this day, whether it's thinking about those lights that lasted for the oil that lasts for 8 nights, or whether it's about all the different battles, glorifying the battles of the Maccabees defeating the Greeks and coming together as a nation to defeat the Greeks. Or we can think about Chanukah as being this great festival of lights.
באנו חושך לגרש בידינו אור באש, כל אחד הוא אור קטן וכולנו אור איתן. סורה חושך על השחור, סורה מפני האור, סורה חושך.
Sorry that my screen gave way at the end over there, but the idea of Chanukah being this festival of lights is really this greatest legacy of Chanukah, where, especially during this year in 2020, we're looking for bringing any sort of light into our world, whether that's the hopefulness of the vaccine doing well in the world, and hopefully eventually that we can celebrate Hanukkah as a festival of lights all together as a community next year as it comes around. And I wanted to take you as one final place, one final spot in Israel. The best place to celebrate Hanukkah isn't in Jerusalem, it isn't in Tel Aviv. It's really in the city of lights, which is Haifa, during the festival of Hanukkah, where they celebrate the Chag Shel Chagim, the festival of festivals, where in the main town square, in the Hameginim Square in Haifa, you always have every year a Christmas tree, a Chanukiah, and a crescent moon all lit up right next to the Baha'i Gardens, which looks down from above, which always is lit up every single night for the first few hours of every single night, trying to bring light to the world and togetherness in that sort of way. And so again, we can think of Hanukkah with all these different legacies in mind and all these different traditions in mind about what makes Hanukkah so special. And for me, what makes Hanukkah so special, whether it's the food or it's the history or whether it's the oil lasting for 8 nights, really the thing that I love most is the fact that it's a holiday that is meant to be celebrated at home, and that from the home, we're meant to be lighting up our homes in order to spread that light to the rest of the world, spreading light from the darkness, from evil in the world, that we should be this great light amongst the nations in that sort of way. And with that, I want to thank you all so much for joining on this tour. I had a lovely, lovely time with you, and I'm happy to stay on for another few moments to answer questions from all of you. But in the meantime, I'm just going to write in the chat for everyone to see in case you wanted to get in touch with me. So my email is josh@hartuvtours.com, and you can leave me a rating if you'd like at TripAdvisor, on Facebook at Hartuv Tours. You can follow me on Instagram or on Twitter at Hartuv Tours. And if you haven't got enough of me this way, you can listen to my latest to my podcast, which I've started relatively recently, called the Critically Zionist Podcast, which is a podcast that is for people who want to be, in a way, look at Zionism with a critical lens, but also realize that Zionism is critical and understanding Zionism in that sort of way. So it's a podcast that I've started that we've already put out a whole bunch of different episodes. So you can feel free to look that up anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you're not sick of my voice already, maybe you'll get sick of it from listening to the podcast, but feel free to tell me what you think about that if you have a listen. And with that, I'll turn the floor back over to the rabbi, and if she's still around. And with that, thank you all so much for joining on this tour with you. It was just really, really fun to be with you on Hanukkah. And with that, I'm going to light my seventh candle by putting my Maccabi beer up there with the rest of the Maccabi beers. And I'm happy to stay on and answer some questions from you all. So feel free to unmute and ask any questions you might have about the presentation.
Josh, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I think we all really enjoyed it. And I definitely loved hearing the history in a really fun and entertaining way. So thank you very much. And I just want to also remind everybody here that tomorrow we are doing our final Hanukkah party put on by the Brotherhood. Everybody's invited. It's a night of laughs. We're doing a cooking demonstration by Cantor Loomer, and we have Mishpocha Meloiches, Family Feud. So that's coming up tomorrow, and I want to remind you of that.
Amazing. Well, thank you all so much for joining.
And you're invited, Josh.
And, oh, that's so fun. And thanks, Cora, for organizing all of this. Zadie, it's so nice to see you. And I'm so glad that you got to join. And and I hope you all have a really lovely Chanukah. And I'll see you hopefully in Israel sometime soon.
Thank you. As usual, I'm going to leave this room open for a little bit if anybody wants to say hi to anyone else in the room.
All right, if there aren't any questions, then I'm going to head back to sleep now because it is 2:10 in the morning. So it's really nice to be with all of you guys, and I'll speak with you soon from Tel Aviv. Bye.
Oh, it's absolutely awesome. Thank you. Oh my goodness, that's so great.
Thank you, Josh. That was a very nice presentation. Of course, I'm prejudiced. Can you hear me
He's
okay?
fun, isn't he? Oh,
Can you hear me okay, Josh?
I think he must have been frozen.
Okay. Josh is my grandson, so that's why I'm
It's
prejudiced.
so wonderful that you get to see him present.
Very good. Thank you for having me on.
You too.
Bye now.
Bye. I'm going to end the meeting, Marla.